Hello, this short video is designed to introduce you to the concepts of active and passive insufficiency. And so this is in regards to your goniometer lab, the introductory goniometer lab that you're going to be doing with the hip and the knee. And so I didn't discuss these concepts in lecture, so I wanted to just cover them briefly so that you know what you're looking for in lab. So active and passive insufficiency are related but very different concepts. Okay, and I want you to sort of understand them. I've got a couple of examples here that will help you. And so these concepts, they're functional states that only occur in what we call multi-articular muscles. Okay, so multi-articular, articular means joint, multi means many. So any muscles that cross multiple joints. So if you think about the hamstrings, they cross the hip, they also cross the knee. So that is a multi-articular joint. The gastrocnemius crosses the ankle, it also crosses the knee. The biceps crosses the shoulder, it also crosses the elbow. Okay, so these are what we call multi-articular muscles. And because they cross multiple joints, they get themselves into this situation where they can have active and passive insufficiencies. So these insufficiencies are limitations in the range of motion and or movement capacity at a joint due to muscle characteristics occurring at another joint associated with that same muscle. Okay, so it's a bit of a mouthful, but if we think about the hamstring, an active or passive insufficiency would be, let's say there's movement happening at the knee. That movement that's happening at the knee is going to limit the movement capacity at the hip. Okay, or same thing with the biceps. It crosses the shoulder and the elbow. So movement that's happening at the elbow is going to impact or limit the movement capacity at the shoulder. Okay, so it's somewhat a disadvantage of these multi-joint muscles. And just a little trick for you to remember the difference between these. Active insufficiency happens when you're trying to actively produce force. So when you're trying to contract a muscle and generate force. A passive insufficiency occurs when you are trying to just pass through a range of motion, and your range of motion is limited due to passive tension built up in that muscle. So let's break these two down and discuss them separately. So we've got active insufficiency. This is when you have that multi-articulate muscle, and an active insufficiency occurs when movement of one articulation changes the leverage of the muscle at another articulation. Okay, and I'm going to ask you just to think about the hamstrings because that's the one we're going to use in lab to demonstrate passive insufficiency. And so, what happens with this active insufficiency is contraction of the muscle that's occurring at one joint generates almost like slack. Okay, so there's some slack built up in that muscle, and that's going to reduce the force production capacity at the other joint location. Okay, so basically, the active motor component that's happening at one joint is going to affect the ability of the muscle to contract at another joint. Okay, and we're going to use the hamstring to describe this phenomenon. So the hamstring passes the hip and the knee. So its job is to extend the hip and flex the knee. Okay. Let's say that muscle, that hamstring, is the individual is laying prone on their stomach and they flex their knee. Okay, so they're contracting their hamstring to do this. What's happening here is you are contracting the muscle, but it's creating somewhat like a slack-like phenomenon in the muscle, so that if the individual tries to extend the hip, they can't build up enough tension in the hamstring to actually contribute to hip extension. Okay, so this effectively, when you try this in the lab, this effectively will reduce your capacity for generating any sort of hip extension when your knee is in this position. And it's because of this active insufficiency. Because you're actively flexing the knee, you're not going to be able to actively extend the hip. Okay. And the kind of a great analogy for any muscle, and you'll probably hear me say this a lot in this course, is think about it like an elastic band, right? So if there is slack at this part of the elastic band, if you start to pull on the elastic band at the hip, it's not going to it's not going to create tension in the elastic band. Now, if you are to extend the knee, what that does is it pulls on that elastic band and creates tension so that you can use that hamstring to generate hip extension. Okay, so this is a prime example of an active insufficiency. Another great example is, oh, sorry, before we move on to the second example, just a question I want to pose to you. How do you think we can use this concept of active insufficiency for specific training and for specific rehab purposes? Take a minute to think about that. I've given you the answer on the slide here. Okay. But essentially, you can utilize that to target certain muscles. So if we want to target the gluteus maximus, which is also a hip extensor, if we can get the hamstring into an active insufficiency position, then we effectively eliminate it as a hip extensor and we can just target the gluteus maximus. So if you've ever seen any exercises for the glutes where somebody has their knee flexed in this position and maybe they're kicking back, that is so that they can target the gluteus maximus while limiting the contributions of the hamstring. Another great example is the soleus and gastrocnemius complex. Okay, so the soleus is not a multi-articular joint. So it does not pass the knee. It only passes the ankle. Okay, whereas the gastrocnemius passes the ankle, but it also passes the knee and attaches onto the femur, right? So in order for the gastrocnemius to contract, you really have to have the knees extended in order to generate some tension at the knees so that you don't have an active insufficiency at the ankle. Okay, so if you bend the knee or flex the knee to 90 degrees, what you've done is you've created this insufficiency so that the gastrocnemius cannot contract any longer, and you're going to rely on the soleus. Anyone who has trained these muscles probably is familiar with this phenomenon. Now, let's move on to passive insufficiency, okay? And so, again, it's related but distinct concept. So this is if you have a multi-articular muscle and it's unable to lengthen sufficiently to allow full range of motion at more than one articulation simultaneously. Okay, so you're going to do this in lab. And so restricting the range of motion at one joint, this is when you get, a restriction in the range of motion at one joint because of the position of another joint. Okay, this is when you have lengthened a multi-joint muscle fully at both ends, and it's going to prevent range of motion from being achieved at each joint. So you cannot have full range of motion at both joints when you have a multi-articular muscle. And so the example you're going to use in lab is the hamstring. And maybe you've done this before, maybe you haven't. But when you combine so hip and knee movement, or hip flexion and knee flexion and extension, are linked through this passive insufficiency model. And so what you're going to do in lab is you're going to flex your hip with your knee extended and flex your hip with your knee flexed. And what you'll find is in this first scenario here, your hip flexion will be limited due to a passive insufficiency. So because you are stretching the hamstring fully at the knee, it's going to limit your potential for hip flexion because of the passive stretch of that hamstring. Okay. In this scenario number 2, where you have the knee flexed, what you're doing is you're generating some slack in that hamstring from a passive perspective. So you're going to be able to generate more flexibility at the hip for that reason. Okay. I hope this helps you to understand those two concepts, and I hope that you get a chance to watch this before you go to lab number 1.